Thanks very much everybody for coming, and thank you to Policy Exchange for hosting this. I know that HE fringe events are relatively few and far between, so it's great to have this very important session, I think, on the future of funding of higher education. As a journalist on Times Higher Education, introduce myself, I'm John Gill, I'm editor of THE. Really, higher education funding policy has been the gift that keeps on giving for us journalists. You know, for the last 4 years we've had non-stop stories, U-turns, unintended consequences, which have been fascinating to write about, and I'm sure even more fascinating for Vice Chancellors to try and grapple with. Obviously it's been a huge issue on the political agenda at the start of the Parliament. We had the riots, we had Nick Clegg's I'm Sorry mash-up, which I'm sure you'll remember, and that was led on to a Parliament where really we all got far more familiar with terms like the RAB charge than we ever wanted to be. Does anyone know what the RAB charge is currently? I guess it's 45% roughly. This is the proportion of fees which will never be repaid, and that's up very significant from the mid-20% that was originally forecast when the new loan system was set up. We also watched with amazement as David Willetts, recently departed Higher Education Minister, predicted that £9,000 would be the exception rather than the rule for universities to charge. There are currently 2 higher education institutions in the country that don't charge 9k for at least some of their courses. And they are the University of Sunderland and University College Birmingham, so we're in the right place for this debate. We've also, in the last week or two, had the curiosity of seeing £6,000 fees trailed very heavily by Labour and then seemingly ditched at the last minute from Ed Miliband's speech. I had somebody say that you could almost see the exact point in his speech which it had been cut from. And yeah, we may have just forgotten. That's supposedly because Ed Balls, among others, thinks the £2 billion cost of replacing that lost tuition fee income for universities just isn't worth it at the ballot box. So it's a very tangled area, and I think something that we need for stellar panellists to bring some clarity to today. So I'll just introduce you to those 4. To my left we have Carl Lygo, who's Vice Chancellor of BPP University, a private for-profit institution that gained university status under David Willetts' drive to raise the profile of alternative providers. BPP, of course, focuses primarily on business law, the professions, and Carl's biog tells me that he's just been named, or was named, one of the UK's Hot 100 lawyers by the Lawyer magazine, which I think, Carl, means that you might have been able to shot with marrying George Clooney. Yeah. Next to Carl is Margot James, MP for Stourbridge since 2010. Preceded by a successful career in business. Margot is PPS to William Hague and the Governor of the London School of Economics, which of course has the highest proportion of international students of any of our mainstream universities. So I'll be particularly interested to hear what Margot has to say on the impact of immigration policy on higher education. To my right, Nick Ratcliffe is Head of Policy, Education and Student Experience at the Russell Group, the group of 24 large research-intensive universities. He joined the Russell Group last year, having previously worked as an education consultant at KPMG and at the Learning and Skills Council and at the Further Education Funding Council. And finally, the lineup is Jonathan Simons, Head of the Education Unit at Policy Exchange, our generous host today. Any complaints about canapes to Jonathan? He was previously Head of Strategy for Education and Health at Serco, Head of Open Public Services at the Cabinet Office, and Head of Education in the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit under both Gordon Brown and David Cameron. So that's the lineup. We are going to have initial pitches from each of our panellists. I'm going to ask you all to stick as strictly as possible to 5 minutes. I may allow you up to 7 minutes, and then I'm going to have to call time to allow a good half hour at least for Q&A with the audience. And I was going to do it in the order that I was given on my printout, which, Margot, if that's okay, means starting with you.
Well, thank you very much, John, and good afternoon, everybody. I went to university myself in the 1970s when, of course, there were no university fees for home students. And the battle royal on my campus was instigated by something called the Overseas Students Action Committee, who were very angry about a relatively small fee being charged to students from overseas. So it was a very different environment, and students, when this issue became so controversial 3 or 4 years ago, used to challenge me saying, well, you went to university, you didn't have to pay anything and so on. But of course, when I left university, like everybody else, I was immediately stuck on a basic rate of income tax of about 35%, I think it was in those days. And the point I want to make here is that this has to be paid for either way. It either has to be paid for out of general taxation, endowments, or by the individual students. And as we all know, in those days, only about 5% of young people went to university, and now it's almost 50% of young people. And that really was the scene setter that prompted the last Labour government to appoint Lord Brown to look at the whole issue of raising student fees. Although it does seem to the actual student a lot of money, and I know that parents and students worry about the debt issue, it is in terms of a loan to start your career off, if you were to see it in those terms, it is a loan on extremely generous terms. I've known young people who didn't go to university trying to set up their own businesses, and they say to me, you know, this is a good deal. And of course it is, because you don't have to pay it back until you're earning quite a high threshold of income, above average actually, compared to other countries who have a similar system. The repayment rates start later in the UK compared to the average. For me, the priorities when you look at financing university education are first twofold really for me. One is social mobility. I would not want any system to put off young people from poorer backgrounds from changing their life opportunities through studying at a good university for a degree that will help them in their future career. That is an absolute priority for me. The other big priority for me is to ensure that our universities retain their place in the global world rankings. We have a higher education sector in this country of which we can be immensely proud. Almost 20% of the world's top 100 universities are in this country. And 5 of our 4 universities are in the top 10. And that's Oxford, Cambridge, University College London and Imperial College London. And I'm quite sure LSE would be in that top 10, were it not for it being a specialist university. And it's hard for a specialist to compete with generalists on the criteria. So those are the real priorities for me. And I just wanted to say a few words about how LSE cope with the issues that I have raised. They decided to adopt the standard 9,000 fee, and I did slightly cringe when I heard David Willett say that this, wouldn't be automatic. A lot of universities might choose to charge less. The reason being because I know that the actual cost of providing higher education at this level exceeds £9,000 for most courses in most universities. And if we want to achieve that goal of maintaining the standard of, and the ranking of our universities, we're going to have to, possibly accept that fees in the future may even have to rise. But LSE have coped with it by instituting the 9,000 fee, and also they have a very good record of using the vast majority of income that formed that increase from 6,000 per year to 9,000 per year to fund fairer access schemes. And LSE have a very good, over 70% of their students, British undergraduates, come from state schools. So that's a good record. The record at LSE that I've tried to change is that the vast majority of those students come from London and the South East. And one of the reasons for that is that their fair access programmes are all local. They all take place in London. And I have got them, as a governor, to reach out beyond London. And the new American principal, Professor Craig Calhoun, has been very good in that respect. And we now have fair access programmes into the London School of Economics based in the Black Country. I am a Black Country MP, so there's a bit of a bias there. Finally, the point about foreign students and immigration policy. Obviously, the lifting of the cap on students, on undergraduates, there is, the Office for Fair Access is concerned, or HEFCE, I can't remember which one it is, but one of them has registered their concern that we will have disproportionate numbers of students from the European Union taking up places. And that is a worry because the RAB rate that you mentioned is currently 45%, might actually decline if we get too much of a skew towards students studying from outside the UK, because the collection rate is more difficult and more challenging outside the UK. So that is an issue. But I'm afraid that because I mentioned the cost of providing these degrees is usually in excess of £9,000 a year, if we want to keep our fees at that level, we will have to have foreign students to pay the difference. There isn't any other way really of cutting the cake. You either have fewer students overall, or you have higher fees, or you have more students from overseas making up the difference between the cost of providing the education and the numbers of British students who are subsidised to take it. So I hope I've set the scene a little bit for some of the key issues. I look forward to hearing questions afterwards and hearing from the other speakers. Thank you.
Great question. Thanks very much. It's good to hear the world rankings mentioned. The THE world rankings are published this Thursday. And I hope that's what you're referring to, none of the cheap alternatives. Carl.
So I'm delighted that BPP was able to sponsor this and to give an opportunity for so many people to gather here and talk about higher education. It's a real shame that there's only one or two fringe events here that are talking about higher education, and I can see from the audience we've got Vice Chancellors, former Presidents of the National Union of Students and current in the audience, so there's much more learned people than I to talk about this subject. But I wanted to really make a few points. One is I think the great strength of our British system is having a diverse approach and having a diverse system for higher education. Unfortunately, I think the funding model is built upon the paradigm of a full-time 3-year rites of passage study, highly capital intensive, that doesn't actually promote alternative routes into higher education. I think BPP has got an approach. I'm not suggesting this is the only approach, but it is an approach that offers an alternative. We have, as John was indicating, concentrated mainly on things like law, business accounting, some...
Someone's in the room.
All attempts to silence me fail. So we educate lawyers, accountants, dentists, nurses and so forth. We have, in 2009, started offering our first undergraduate degrees. We decided very quickly, because everybody told us we couldn't do it, to offer 2-year accelerated degrees. That's where a student studies all the way through the summer period. Typically a 32-week period of 1 year study can be turned into 2 years of study over 2 years of 104 weeks. So you can get in the 32-week year study period. We do that, and the total cost to the student in terms of fees was £12,000 until this year and has now risen to £14,000. That compares to the £27,000 that you would pay in a traditional university built upon the sort of rites of passage kind of education. So you can significantly reduce the fee, you can also significantly reduce your maintenance cost, and you can get out onto into the workforce much sooner if you want. 51% of our students don't even take out student loans, so they don't even bother the student loan system. And so if you start to reduce the fee and keep it low, you will find that there isn't this great need to take on debt. What I find amazing as well, and I'm really sort of talking to the Conservative members here, is it's very unconservative to encourage young people to take on such massive debt. Every incentive is around debt. If you think about it, most of the students are going to come out of their undergraduate study with £50,000 worth of debt. That's a great encouragement for young people. There is no incentive, for example, for funding your study out of income. Every other European country that I know of will give some kind of tax incentive towards funding your study out of income. In this country, what we do is encourage you to take on debt. Now, the other point that I wanted to raise was around this great clamour that there is at the moment that £9,000 is not enough. Well, if BPP, a profit-making business, can operate an undergraduate degree charging £12,000 in total, are you absolutely convinced, Margot, that £9,000 is not enough? The answer to the question of why does it cost so much is that we're in a luxury good market here. You can charge as much as the consumer is willing to pay. And of course you will say, well, look at the costs of private schools going to Wellington. It's £30,000 a year. That's what's in store for us in this country once we uncap fees of £9,000. If you don't believe me, just look to the US model. In the United States, it costs $57,000 a year to be able to study at Harvard. Multiply that by 4, add a bit more for living costs. That's a tremendous amount of debt, but people are prepared to pay it. It fees inflation in the public and private sector in the US runs at 5 times the rate of general inflation. So the point that I'm making is, we've had no discussion about how do we make the system more efficient. Okay, everything is added to more cost, more debt. Let's concentrate on making it more efficient. Let's not encourage young people to get into debt unnecessarily. Let's encourage them to also save. I was at an event, a fringe event last night, sponsored by the Children's Society, which is attempting, by linking up with credit unions in schools, to reinvent what I had as a kid, which was a savings club, where you got a piggy bank for each time you reached a particular milestone. I think there are some good opportunities there for instilling in young people the desire to start saving for your future, as opposed to always encouraging students to pay up with debt. And of course, we really know what politicians are aiming at. This is a debt that the future generations are going to pay. If only 55 pence in a pound is recovered, then we've got to ask ourselves, would it not be better not to impose these debts on individuals, but to do some direct funding? And I was really impressed last week, we did a similar event and John Denham spoke. He had some interesting, challenging ideas that perhaps we should be charging less. Students should have some skin in the game, but we should be charging less, having some direct funding from government for teaching, not research. Research here is a distractor. 1.6 billion, I think it is, that HEFCE fund research. We're talking about teaching. We're talking about funding teaching, not research. If you want to have the best universities in research ranking, concentrate your research funding, but that's a separate point. I'm talking about teaching. I think John Denham's proposals, charge less, stop messing around with offer because most of it is irrelevant, might be an approach. And I think, bearing in mind that undergraduate degrees are merely a ticket to the dance, you've got to go on and get a professional qualification or even a postgraduate qualification, which aren't funded at the moment. How are you going to do that? Merely getting an undergrad degree and putting kids into so much debt is quite frankly disgusting for this generation.
Thank you, Cole. So we've got fees need to come down, fees may need to go up. Nick, which is it?
Thank you, John. Good afternoon, everybody. If I lose volume, you can't hear me at the back, please let me know. Firstly, to Jonathan, many thanks for inviting me here today. I want to try and cover 2 key points, if I may. Firstly, to talk about why excellent teaching with a good student experience costs money, and why those costs are rising. And secondly, how can we fund leading universities going forwards in the future in a way that is sustainable? So, on costs. University funding has gone through some big changes in recent years, particularly in England, as John kind of highlighted in the introduction, since 2012, introduction of higher fees. The increase of fees in 2003, though, followed by the decision to raise the fee caps in England to £9,000 in 2012, went hand in hand with substantial cuts in government grants for teaching, except some targeted funding for higher cost STEM subjects. This is an important point. I mean, the fee income isn't worth an extra £9,000 per student for every university. It's largely filled that gap caused by the cuts in government grant. And for all universities, there's been a significant cut in capital funding as well from government. Particular educational strength of the Russell Group universities who I represent is a combination of teaching and research excellence, as Carl alluded to, I think. Students working with their field's experts to engage in research processes themselves and having access to cutting-edge facilities. We believe this is a crucial opportunity for students to have that as part of their undergraduate experience. But it means that we're competing in a world market for the leading academics. If we want the best, then we have to pay for them. And with other countries spending a large proportion of their GDP on higher education, that only makes the competition even fiercer. Good teaching also needs to be supported with excellent facilities. Science and engineering courses require some serious kit and materials, and this costs money, particularly for Russell Group universities because of our higher proportion of students doing those sorts of subjects. It's worth remembering that the cost of science courses is such that they often actually make a loss for the university. There's very little incentive for universities to keep providing them. We carry on doing so because we feel they're important and because it's crucial that the government continues to support them. But it's not just subject-specific facilities that cost money. All students, arts, humanities students, as well as young scientists, rightly expect high-class facilities. Millions of pounds have been invested in more books for libraries. Libraries still exist, and we're investing in them. We're also spending money on improved lecture theatres, innovative teaching programmes, the latest software, more professional career services, and smaller class sizes. Finally, our universities are investing, I think as Margot said, in the case of LSE, a large proportion of our income from tuition fees in activities to attract students from a wide range of backgrounds. In 2015-16, 20 Russell Group universities in England will be spending £234 million from additional fee income alone on scholarships, fee waivers and bursaries aimed at attracting the most disadvantaged students into those universities. This includes spending on outreach work, again as Margot alluded to at LSE, including working with teachers and pupils in schools and putting on summer schools and access schemes. So there's a lot going on there. This means that next year Russell Group universities will be spending an average of 33%, a third of their additional fee income on widening participation activities, more than the 26% average across all universities. A lot of that money will go on bursaries and fee waivers, which means many students from poorer backgrounds aren't actually charged £9,000 for their degree. The costs of providing world-class teaching space, libraries and other services are not about to fall. University courses cost money because they need high-quality staff, first-rate facilities, and our universities invest a considerable amount of fee income into attracting future generations of scholars. For many of our universities, the additional fee income has been vital to fill the gap that would otherwise have been left by the dramatic fall in government funding. So given these rising cost pressures, how can we fund universities sustainably in the future? We'd urge the government not to add extra pressures to the higher education budget in England, which will happen unless they change course on plans to completely remove student number controls from 2015. This policy will add real pressure to all university budgets, because increasing the numbers going to universities to a potentially limited extent is expensive, inevitably. When the Chancellor announced this policy at the autumn statement last year, he said it would be funded from the sale of the student loan book. At the time, we said we were dubious about whether that was a good way of covering the additional costs. Then over the summer, Secretary of State Vince Cable announced that the sale was off. We're now extremely concerned that removal of student number controls is going to have a detrimental impact on all students' funding. So the government needs to rethink its policy urgently. We think, the Russell Group, that the fundamentals of the existing fees and funding system are sound. However, we've heard from Carl, some have argued, I think, that the current system is unsustainable due to the estimated RAB charge, source accounting and budgeting charge, being as high as 45% under the current fee regime. There's considerable debate, I think, and Mark Leach on the second round can probably add to this, considerable debate as to why the RAB charge has risen and whether that matters in the short term. So, I've only been able really to touch on some of the issues here, and I'm sure with questions we've got time to do them more justice. Across the UK, we're fortunate to have a high number of great universities universities that are highly regarded and admired across the world. But if we want to maintain that excellence, it will require more investment. Standing still, burying our heads in the sand, won't help universities, and it won't ensure that students get the first-rate education they deserve.
Thanks, Nick. Finally, before we open to the floor for questions, Jonathan.
Yeah, thanks very much. So the title of the fringe is Why on Earth Does Going to University Cost So Much Money? And the way it's written is a deliberately provocative way of saying it. It's why on earth does it cost so much money? It should cost less. And I just want to make a couple of remarks on that point. So broadly, is it an issue how much it currently costs undergraduates to go to university? In a kind of really helpful contribution, I want to say partly yes and partly no. So let's deal with partly no. As Margot sort of touched on it, it is actually a very, very good deal now for young people to go to university. Certainly if we were having an FE fringe now, and we were talking about how good a deal it is for FE students to go to FE college, they would rightly talk about the much more generous settlement that you get for going to university than you do for going to an FE college, or even undertaking any form of apprenticeship or workplace learning, let alone, as Margot says, trying to set up your own business. Actually, the fact that you do have what is essentially an interest-free loan that is contingent upon your earnings and that is written off after a number of years if you haven't paid it off is a remarkably good deal. And one of the things that sometimes doesn't get appreciated, I think, is actually quite why the RAB charge is so expensive. It is precisely because the government has put in place a very good deal. We could lower the RAB charge at a stroke tomorrow by, for example, reducing the threshold at which you have to pay or not writing off your loan after a number of years. It's a conscious policy decision as to why this current system costs the government so much money. I think it's broadly the right decision, but it's partly an accident why the RAB charge is so high, and it's partly to do with how we've modelled and what we've assumed of various things, but it is at least in large part a conscious policy decision as to why it costs so much money to go to university, and I think that's a good thing. And indeed, the numbers bear that out. So after a short dip, actually numbers going to university now are at record highs. We've got record income going into the HE sector overall. We've got record flows of deprived students going into universities, including to Russell Group and other high-intensive research universities. These are all good news stories, and in fact a lot of people thought at the time of Brown, just like they thought incidentally when the last government raised fees, that that would put students off. And it is worth noting, actually, and praising ourselves collectively for the wisdom of young people to continue to recognise that it is, on the whole, worthwhile going to university. So that's why it's not an issue in some senses. Everyone is charging £9 grand. We didn't think they would. When I was in government, one of my jobs I had to do was I had to play a very minor role in thinking about what kind of the implementation of Brown would look like, and nobody in government thought that it would be £9 grand. Everyone thought that it would be more like £6 grand. And a lot of the modelling was done on that basis. And actually, it's a really interesting example of, for all the government now talks about behavioural economics, actually nobody in government really understood behavioural economics in 2010. Why would you, as a university, charge less than £9 grand? It makes you look cheap, it makes you look second rate. So of course, you will charge £9,000, particularly if all your competitors are charging £9,000, because then you're not going to lose out any students to them. It's a classic example of government, as I say, just misunderstanding incentives and behavioural economics. It's a really interesting case study. Why is it potentially an issue, the current system? Well, as I say, I don't think the RAB charge is that big a deal. I think it is at least partly a conscious policy decision, and I think if we wanted to, we could very, very quickly reduce it. But there are a couple of issues with our current system. The first one is, as Carl talked about, it is essentially a 3-year campus-based rite of passage model. And within the good figures that I talked about earlier, actually people that don't do those routes are falling down. So part-time entrants are going down, mature students are going down quite significantly. So if we're interested in things like social mobility, then students who disproportionately are likely to do those type of courses are being more seriously affected by this. They're not necessarily going to go and do 3-year full-time campus degree courses. And so I do think it's a worry that for whatever reason, people who want to take a different route are not doing so to quite the same level. And I think that is a big deal. What might you do about it? Well, I was very, very relieved that Labour didn't commit to £6,000 fees. I think that would have been a mistake. I think it would have been a mistake for a couple of reasons. One, I just don't believe that they would have made up the remaining 3K through state funding. So I think universities would have ended up with less money overall. I say would have in the conditional sense, of course. It's entirely possible that they will still commit to 6K at some point before the election. I do think that would be a mistake. As I say, firstly, because I think universities would lose out overall. But secondly, even if they don't, I think that puts universities more at the largesse of future chancellors of the Exchequer. I think one of the good things about the current system is it is almost entirely student-led now. So leave research funding out for a second. Your teaching is almost entirely dependent on how many students you can attract. If you get more students, you get more money. If you have fewer students, you get less money. And as a university vice-chancellor, I like the idea, I'm not a university vice-chancellor, were I ever to ascend to those giddy heights, I would like the fact that it is largely within my control how well my university does in terms of income, and I think anything that puts that at risk I think is very worrying. I also don't like a graduate tax model for various reasons, which I'm now not going to repeat, but certain people in the audience were very sniffy last time I talked about why I think a graduate tax is a bad idea. I'm very happy to talk in Q&A about why I think a graduate tax is a bad idea, but I don't think that that's a solution. I do think that universities like Carl's, though, are an interesting piece of the puzzle to pay, because if Carl can, as he does, charge £6,000 for a degree which is very, very highly respected by the institutions in which his students graduate into, then that starts to put more competitive pressure on other universities. And unsurprisingly, from a policy exchange perspective, we are all in favour of diverse and pluralist markets in this place. We are all in favour of a variable fee structure, but I don't want to mandate that from government. I want more universities who feel able to charge different fee levels, who can come up with their behavioural economic reasons why they think they can charge a lower price. So I am interested in more universities trialling different ways in which they can deliver something for lower cost, and that, I think, is a way to square the circle between government forcing a reduction of the cap or alternatively raising the cap and phasing more increases. So that's the kind of thing that I'm really interested in, and that's the thing which I hope we'll start to see more in the HE sector.
Thank you, Jonathan. Well, thanks to all four panellists. What I'm going to do is ask for questions in a moment. I would please ask you all to actually ask a question. No monologues. Keep it to the point, and do tell us who you are, where you're from, and if you'd like to ask questions of a particular member of the panel, then make that clear as well. Before I do that, Carl, I just want to pick up one point that you made. You talked about delivering degrees for £12,000 total cost.
Yeah.
Could you do that if you were the sponsor of UCL?
Well, I'd have to look at the economics, so I don't know anything about their business. Let me just clarify that we've been delivering those degrees at £6,000 up until this year, and now students move on to paying £7,000 who start again, because I've been following on Twitter that there was some discussion about that. Could you do it? Well, I don't know what their economic model is. When I look at what students say they want in the Which HEPI survey, they want lower fees, better quality teaching, more contact time in small groups. I've written for Wonky a piece where I've calculated what that cost is based upon average lecturer salaries and the normal contact hours that a lecturer teaches, the usual property costs that HEFCE provide, including libraries, and I still think you can do it for £6,000 to £7,000. So I don't know where the money is going. And of course you can start to say, oh well, we need this piece of special kit, we need that piece of special kit. Okay, there may be something there that I'm missing, but I can't see it. I do train accountants, so I may not be the most appropriate person.
Okay, let's have some questions from the audience. Is there a mic? Oh, there's no mic. No. Quintin, do you want to?
Yeah, I can shout. Quintin McKellar from the University of Hertfordshire. Carl, absolutely, hugely support your idea of diversity. Completely behind the idea of two-year degrees, etc. But the question is, how much do you charge your dentist students? Because my understanding is a year in dentistry is costing, even through BPP, £22,000 a year. Now, in mainstream universities where there's a diversity of subjects, of course, and you can argue whether this is right or wrong, but there's cross-subsidy between subjects, and it's a different model. And I think we need to accept that within diverse universities that cross-subsidy occurs, and consequently we're subsidising some of the more expensive subjects like pharmacy and so on at the expense of the less expensive.
Yeah, I think that. So, I mean, do you want to answer that? There's some cross-subsidy.
So the quick point is that at the moment, I don't think the student loans company is set up to incentivise mainstream universities to do two-year degrees. So students can only recover a maximum, I think it is, of £9,000 for each year, regardless of how you deliver it. So at the moment, there's no incentive for you to reduce the fee for your student, even if you wanted to. And that's appalling. On dentistry specifically to BPP, the students are earning money whilst they're doing that. And it is expensive because obviously you've got the kit that's needed for that particular thing. So I do accept that that's a higher fee, but the students are earning money whilst they're doing their dentistry training, and that money outweighs the fee by something like 2 to 3 to 1.
I mean, I've also heard Vice Chancellors say that actually if you do charge a differential fee, as for example they did at Salford, all you get, you spend your whole time fielding complaints from the students that are paying more, saying I just don't understand why as a physicist I should be paying more than the classroom-based subject student that's down down the corridor. I mean, is that not a sort of a simple fact that actually students don't necessarily want to pay differential fees? They would rather have a flat base across the board. I don't know if that's sort of the experience of Russell Group universities now.
I think it's quite hard to tell at the moment in the current system what students would pay, given that up front the cost is nil. The student loan company provides, whether the fees are 6,000, 8,000, 9,000. So I don't think we've got a system at the moment where those, perhaps as Carl says, where those incentives are there. So it's a difficult hypothetical question to answer.
Right, let's have another question. Lady here in the third row.
So I'd like to just comment to the gentleman on the Russell Group. So I have attended at 10-year intervals 3 Russell Group universities. I've paid significantly more each time I've attended, and I would say that my quality of education has deteriorated as I've paid more, which I find very disappointing. But my question to the panel is this: if we consider the UK as GBPLC, and you take any other business organisation, and the higher education department is the training department for that company, in no other business would you go out and train your competitors. Why then are we so willing to take so many foreign students into our universities for their fees to support our own training department when they then return to their countries to be able to undercut GBPLC? That's my question.
And what we should be doing, presumably, is keeping them here and letting them work in this country so that the GDP is generated for Britain. That's presumably the point you're making. Margot, do you want to field that one?
That was a bit of a curved ball. I'm just trying to remember exactly what you said about your in your last question, because I was a bit distracted by your view that we shouldn't be accepting all these students from overseas. The point is they pay more than £9,000 to most universities. So that is really one. If you were to put some artificial cap to limit the number of overseas students from outside the European Union, I'm talking about. You would cause a funding crisis in higher education, because all of a sudden every student would be paying £9,000 or possibly even less, and the whole thing would collapse. So foreign students, quite apart from the very huge benefits in my view that they bring to the general educational experience of all students, and I say that as a former LSE student, where we had a huge proportion of students from overseas, marvellous experience it was to be mixing with all these different cultures, etc. Quite apart from that, we basically need them because they are subsidising our higher education system. On your point, I won't duck it about the working afterwards. I regretted the changes to the work-study visa system that we introduced at the beginning of the government, and I think they have been to a degree softened. But certainly LSE did, lobby very hard against that policy changing. I mean, that was a policy whereby a student could come from China or wherever and study for 3 years or however long. I take your point, Carl, it shouldn't have to just be 3-year degrees. I think you're absolutely right about that. And then they would be entitled to work for up to 2 years in the UK. And a lot of students did that to pay their the loan they'd taken out in their own countries to pay it off. So it did cause quite a problem, the change to that policy, which is one of the reasons it has been softened.
Okay, thank you. Jonathan, did you want to pick up this?
Yeah, just to say, I have a dream. I've already been a Vice-Chancellor, now I'm Martin Luther King. I would like a scenario in which every single world leader had been educated in a British university. I'd like a scenario in which every single CEO of a company had been educated in a British university. I would like a scenario in which every man and woman of remote influence in this world had been educated in a British university. Because the more people that have, the more people that understand British values, the more people who understand the British way of life, and frankly, the more soft power we have as this country. So I think it's a tremendous boost, the work our universities do with foreign students. I love the fact that some of them go on to huge positions of influence, and I only wish there were more of them.
Yeah.
Another question. The hand shot up over there in the... Yep.
Yes, first of all, I'm glad Jonathan made the point that university fee is almost a gifting good, because nobody wants to seem to be undercutting it because they seem to be cheap. But the point I want to make was, as an accountancy graduate of BPP, the buildings I studied in then, which I think was an old Victorian school, came nowhere near the standard of the ancient buildings I studied at in Oxford. And that is what, of course, one of the reasons why it costs so much at Oxford. Why do we have to look for these fantastic buildings when in fact all you need is a place to sit down and listen to your lecturer?
So, okay, what should we do about Oxford's fancy building? That's one for you, surely. What's the Russell Group's position?
Russell Group's position is that fantastic, good students and excellent student experience, deserves good teaching space and good research space. So we're investing a lot of money in it. We're, I think, rarely been investing so much money in it. And the money that we're investing is because the government has ceased to pay grant. The money that we're investing, a lot of it is obviously undergraduate fee income. So yes, we need good spaces, but that's also why at the moment we're charging the money that we are for fees, because that stuff needs to be maintained. You probably can do something a little cheaper, more cheap and cheerful, but that's not what we choose to do. Our students come to us and they expect the best, and that's what we try and offer them.
Okay.
Why?
Why? Quite right too. I would say.
Well, let's have a gentleman here in the middle. Yep.
Hi, Matt Gass, I'm a two-time BPP graduate.
Are you stacking the
It was like this in the Labour conference.
My question, it's been touched on a bit, but I was wondering if the panelists could try and come close to putting some kind of figure on what it actually costs to educate a university student, as opposed to how the cost is borne. It's around £9,000 and different BPP. But what the cost is for various topics, touches different for dentistry and other things. And also, I wanted to ask if the panelists thought the university should be allowed to fail, and if it should be easier to start a new one to include these one first as the University of Buckingham.
So, two questions really. One, how much does it actually cost? And two, should universities be allowed to fail? I mean, on the issue of cost, we had the Vice Chancellor of Oxford, didn't we, suggesting that he thought it was around about £16,000 to teach a student at Oxford. I suppose it varies very much by discipline and by university. Does anyone particularly want to field that question?
I mean, I can have a crack. I mean, we're back. Well done. As John says, I mean, the problem is that there isn't a typical cost. It does vary by subject, it varies by institution, it may vary according to the number of factors. And deciding, within all the overheads, actually what is the unit cost is quite tricky. And if we tried to fund it on that basis, then you'd have a system that was incredibly complicated. So we've moved away from that to a more sort of flat rate, £9,000 fee. The government tops that up with a grant for STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering and maths, recognising that those costs are higher. Again, that starts to get a bit nuanced in terms of different subjects. I think the Scots have a more complicated system still. So I think the answer is it depends very much on how many students you've got doing what where. And there isn't a single figure I can quote you there for, I'm afraid.
I mean, I think as well, students, my own feeling on this is that students, if they got itemised bills essentially saying this is what you're paying for, it would be a complete disaster, because of course they would realise that some of the things they were paying for, the fancy buildings that need up, they will never benefit from some of these long-term capital projects that they're funding. It will be students further down the line, but of course universities are long-term. The way they're run is necessarily long-term. So the second point of that question, should universities be allowed to fail? We've been waiting for a university to fail, not in a morbid sense. We've been told that universities will be, fail there, they're not too big to fail, and they haven't. I think if one or two have come relatively close, not to failing. There's certainly some of them that are at risk, and have to obviously monitor them and keep close tabs on them. I mean, Jonathan, what's your view on this? Should universities be allowed to fail? And if one were to, how would the sector step in and make sure that the students who were involved weren't sort of...
Yeah, so let me take the easier half of the question first, which is, should we have more easier for entry? Yes, I think we should. My own view is that it is still quite time consuming to go through the various processes of, well, lastly getting university status, followed by getting teaching degree awarding powers or research degree awarding powers, and then before that passing the career threshold and so on. And there are a lot of FE colleges and private industries in this country who might like to go further down that route, who are put off by the time-consuming and cost of it. And so I would like to see lower barriers to entry, whilst protecting kind of the reputation, and particularly protecting university title. I think it's really interesting. I wouldn't want to see that being given out to anyone, but I would like to see more people come into the market. Should universities be allowed to fail? Yes, I think they should, because they're not too big to fail, just like we should allow any institution to fail, in inverted commas. The question is what that means. I think in practice you're much more likely to see a kind of merger or acquisition or a takeover rather than just a university just closing, not least because you've got kind of horrendously expensive capital equipment just sort of sitting there. If it was just an empty building, you would just sort of shut it up and let it go to rot. But I would be interested, as I am interested in all public service markets, of seeing greater contestability of that asset. I think if there are institutions that are not able to deliver education of the quality that means that they can deliver what students want and what the QAA demand, then yes, there should be greater activity. In terms of how you protect students, I think largely, as I say, I'd imagine in principle it would be much more likely to be a kind of a merger or a takeover or some form of process which would safeguard everyone at the institution. You wouldn't just literally lock the gates on day one.
Yeah, Margot?
Well, I was just thinking in the further education sector, that's just what happens. I mean, I've been involved in one college which was approaching financial instability, and it was merged into a bigger college which had, a positive balance sheet. So if it can happen in FE, why shouldn't it happen in higher education?
Fine. Gentleman here, orange top.
Piers Walton from Gatwick Airport. We obviously employ a very large number of people, and we've been looking with a lot of interest at university technology colleges.
Oh, good.
Oh, thank you. University technology colleges, and I'd be very interested, particularly thinking of pluralism, what the panel's view is of this very interesting halfway house. Obviously works very, very well in Germany, and they've been reaping the benefits of that for many years. So I'd be very interested in what the panel thought of that.
I mean, Margot, maybe it would be good to feel
Yes, I'm extremely positive towards university technical colleges, and we've got several quite near to, but not near enough my constituency. I've got a lot of young people who would benefit hugely from them. You can go at age from 14 to 18. You do a core academic curriculum, English, maths and science, but then you do technical skills, technical qualifications to a high level. And JCB sponsor one in Derbyshire, and clearly the specialist technical qualifications that they will lay on will be oriented to what they need in their business. So I think more and more businesses, and I'm delighted to hear that the airport, I can't remember which one you said you were, Gatwick. Gatwick, I'm considering it. I only wish you were nearer the Black Country, and I'd be snapping your hand off. We need more of them. There aren't enough at the moment.
So another
Can I just on UTCs? I really like the concept of UTCs. I worry a little bit about how they are panning out. In fact, I was talking to somebody about this morning that was talking about a very highly regarded UTC which they've got on their patch. But that has not always been the case. So Hackney, for example, which is one of the flagship ones, is actually closing. There's a few others that have got very, very low pupil numbers. They haven't had great Ofsted reports through. And I think the difficulty with UTCs, much as I would like them to succeed, is they're just the latest incarnation of trying to put a 14 to 19 infrastructure on what is essentially an 11 to 16 or 11 to 18 secondary system. So because pupils transition at 11, actually most pupils who you want to go to UTCs at 14 are kind of loath to do so, and in fact schools fight tooth and nail to keep them. By contrast, the schools are desperate to kick out certain pupils at 14, and UTCs can act as a bit of a dumping ground, which which is not at all what they're meant to be doing, but I rather suspect is happening in certain instances. And if that happens, then of course you get into a vicious spiral where nobody wants to go to a UTC because it is seen as a dumping ground. So I really, really want them to succeed. I think that the aim is laudable, but I'm nervous about what's happening.
Can I just ask a question about the world rankings were mentioned earlier, and they've obviously become hugely influential in higher education policy globally. One of the problems with rankings, I suppose, is that they do tend to measure research performance rather than teaching. And I know the debate today is primarily about teaching quality. And Carl, you spoke sort of interesting about disaggregating teaching and research and saying, look, we're not talking about paying for research here. Does that mean that, in your view, world rankings don't really matter, that we shouldn't worry so much about them, and we're sort of British universities?
I think standardised testing and rankings are at the heart of the many of the problems that we have in our education system. And I could write a book about that, but you've got to be bold. The thing about the UTCs that I like, and bear in mind, about 70% of BPP's income is derived straight from employers. Is getting close to employers, and it's what employers want. As soon as you're comfortable working with employers and designing programs that suit their needs and their employees' needs, you no longer have to worry about whether you've got a swimming pool and a gymnasium and a massive quality lecture theatre, all those kind of things. What you're delivering for is a captive market for the employer, and ensuring that the employee is satisfied is obviously a big, important thing. Research rankings are meaningless in this kind of world. What you're delivering is something that's complementary to those specialist universities that are doing research. Very much like what the Russell Group is doing, I think the research funding ought to be concentrated in those universities and liberate the rest of us from trying to have to mimic the Oxbridge model. I don't care if you think that BPP is something less because it's not like a Russell Group university. What I care about are whether my students are getting jobs, whether employers are supporting my university students. And I think that's more important in a diverse system. There are ways in which you can get your education. We've got representatives here from ACCA, from the Chartered Institute of Securities and Investment. I can tell you that there are massive job vacancies in our financial services and banking sector that aren't being filled because we have a preoccupation with a full-time rites of passage 3-year university experience.
Surely this is a big risk, though, here, that the sort of laser-like focus on employability and graduate premiums and so on, you start to ignore all the hugely valuable elements of scholarship and being in a research active, research-informed teaching and all those things that I'm sure Nick would sort of extol about.
But the key, John, is not to impose one model on everybody. And at the moment, the way the funding model works, it is to impose one model on everybody.
Okay, let's have another question. Lady here in the second row.
Hilary Wheel from LSE. I don't necessarily want to ask Jonathan exactly why you object to graduate tax, but partly that, but also interesting to hear why. But also, how likely is it that you or any of the other panel thinks that or another type of funding model or something will be introduced by an incoming government after next year's election?
Yeah, very good question. Jonathan, do you want to?
Yeah, so why don't I like, there's a number of reasons why I don't like a graduate tax. One is that the best version of a graduate tax that I've had espoused to me is essentially the current system. Why do people like a graduate tax? Because you don't pay anything up front, your payments are contingent on what your income is, and if you have a low income or don't work for a period of time, you don't have to pay it back. That is the current system. Any variant of a graduate tax then either does one of several things. Either it continues for long after you've paid back the full cost of your costs, which I don't think is a good idea, or it leaves universities dependent on the largesse of the future Chancellor of the Exchequer, because it's not money that goes back to the institution, it's money that goes back into the Treasury, which the Treasury then doles out to the institutions. I have to say, I do not have much faith in Chancellors of the Exchequer, plural, to always safeguard the institutions of universities, because they have lots of demands upon their time, and it's very easy to see an element of future graduate tax income not given to universities, but instead given to whatever the priority is. And the third reason I don't like a graduate tax is because it is very, very hard, if not impossible, to get it back off anyone who is not currently resident and paying tax in the UK. We don't have a great record with getting student loan repayments off people, but we have a terrible record, in fact it's almost illegal to get graduate tax off them, so that's why I don't like it. Do I think a variant of university funding is going to come round again? Yes, I do, and I have a sort of a horrible fear from the sector that having just gone through all the kind of the Brown shake-up, that there's going to be another one probably a couple of years into the next Parliament, pretty much whoever's in power, because I think people are very nervous about the current RAB charge. They don't want to do some of the things which could be done to get it down. I suspect we will have another round of funding reform, which is good news for THE.
Will that be, absolutely, will that be something as simple as things that you mentioned earlier, changing the threshold of repayments, changing, interest rates, that sort of thing? Will it be tinkering around the edge, or will it be wholesale change, everything up for grabs?
I think what is most likely to happen, and this is not a good scenario, but I think it's a very likely scenario, is that at some point in about 2017 or 2018, a Treasury civil servant in his or her 20s will point out to the future Chancellor of the Exchequer, whoever he or she is, that this is starting to get really, really expensive and it can't be done. And the Chancellor of the Exchequer, with very, very short notice, will just tell biz or the sector that a large chunk of money is coming out in order to make that work. And that's a terrible scenario, because it's a scenario that leads to kind of all kinds of unforeseen consequences. So I think in order to avoid that, we are going to have a bit more of a root and branch reform than just kind of trimming repayment thresholds.
Margot, are you still involved in the number 10 policy unit?
Yes.
So this is mainlining straight into number 10 heaps. Does this ring true to you? Is there going to be a wholesale shake-up of university funding after the election, whoever's in charge?
It really would be. I know it sounds like.
Now it's number 10.
It sounds like an awful politician's answer, but we haven't. The manifesto is not complete yet, and I can't really comment on what's going to end up in it. I can't.
Strange, isn't it? Sorry, carry on.
But sort of commenting on what you just said, Jonathan, I think any government that comes in, whether it's us or the opposition, given higher education finance has been such a controversial issue earlier on in this government, I think it would be unlikely for a future government in the near future to undertake anything root and branch. We have a system that has delivered some improvements and has reduced the cost to the taxpayer. And so I don't think you'd want to fundamentally change that. But if it were a business, and if I was back running a business and I looked at it, I would see that those thresholds must be quite vulnerable. I would think, for change into the future.
Okay, I think we probably have time for just one or two more questions. So there's a hand up over here. There's no need for a microphone.
Okay. Simon Culhane, we've talked about the cost, and of course now there is a cost. The consumer, the student, now has much more influence and much more control. But I am struck by the fact that 140 universities, only 2, and they are both private, actually do the efficient way of looking at a 2-year degree. So what is the Russell Group's and the LSE's policy on a 2-year degree? Do you think it's a good idea? And if so, will you do one?
Shall I kick off? I think at the moment there's very few examples of 2-year degrees, certainly not 2 years degrees leading to a full honours degree. I think we've got some foundation programmes and some access programmes that go on over 2 years. So it's not something that's very prevalent. I think if there was demand for that, then obviously that might be something that individual institutions would look at. I don't speak for Oxford or Cambridge or LSE, so it's hard for me to say yes, they'll put them on. And I think, as you say, we're in a market at the moment. If that's what students wanted, it's possible. But predominantly, our institutions deliver 3-year undergraduate degrees. There's very high demand for those courses. So in a sense, the model isn't terribly broken, and nobody's trying to fix it yet.
I mean, there is the other example is Birkbeck, which was faced sort of staring down the barrel of real financial problems because of the fall off in part-time students, and they have introduced a part-time, full-time degree. See what I mean? It's done in the evenings whilst you work, but you get the full-time bachelor's degree in 2 years. And it does lay down a challenge to other universities, doesn't it, that this can be done whilst you're holding down a job at the same time. And I mean, it's a challenge that's out there, and you do wonder if universities are going to have to answer it.
Yeah, it is a challenge that's out there. I think it's very, we say, interested. John Denham, I think, talked about this in some of the proposals he made to the Royal Society of Arts in January, thinking about whether you could basically concertina the same amount of teaching and learning into 2 years rather than 3. I think it would be very problematic to try and have in parallel some 3-year courses going on and some 2 years under courses going on. You never get any building work done, for one thing. But I think it would be very complicated to do. Let's say if BPP is successful in their model, then that's,
John, just to put it into context with some numbers. So law undergrad we offer as a 2-year and a 3-year degree. Legal Week, which is a lawyer's magazine, ranked us as the 5th best for quality of teaching out of 147 universities offering law degrees. We are the largest provider of full-time undergraduate law degrees, having this 2- and 3-year strategy. There is a market, it's coming. Of course, it's always going to be difficult to compete with brands like Oxford and Cambridge, but we need choice in this market. And Jonathan, we need proper regulation. Lowering barriers is not a good thing. Look on the Home Office side of things, where you've got 57 private colleges being suspended and 3 public universities. We still need good, high barriers to entry. I'm not saying that just for protection of BPP. It's the reputation of the sector.
Okay, well, I think we've got time for one last question, and Tony Pearce.
I'm Tony, I'm the president of the National Union of Students. I'm probably going to ask the question you're not expecting, which is that we've talked a lot actually about the cost to individual students, or what some of you have said aren't the cost to individual students, and how this is a really good system because 45% of it's not actually being repaid. But I suppose what I want to ask is, why is it also going to create a £94 billion black hole by the early 2030s that the people who are going to university now will be paying off in the early 2030s? It's my generation that will be paying for the system twice. And I think it's both, I don't think it's in the interest of students or graduates or taxpayers to create a system that stores up so much future debt for our economy. So I'd be really interested to know what you think we should be doing about that now, because I don't think it's a sustainable system that creates almost £100 billion worth of additional debt in the next 20 years.
What happens in 2030 when all this debt comes home to roost? Margot?
Well, I think there's been some modelling done in the business department which alights on a RAB rate where it is of long-term benefit to maintain this current system, and then below a certain RAB rate, the whole system does get thrown into question, which is, I think, behind your question. I'm not actually sure what that rate is. Do you know, Jonathan?
I don't know.
It's 47%.
Yeah,
47% at the moment.
So we are running it very close, and so I think you raise a very fair question. I don't think that you'll be paying twice though, because ultimately it will fall to general taxation to pick up the difference. Your generation, indeed. Yes, but at least you will have benefited from the university education. Imagine if you were one of the 50% that didn't even...
I didn't go to university.
You didn't go to university, but you're president of the National Union of Students.
It's a long story.
It's very interesting. That's fascinating. That's very, very interesting. I'll rephrase. If you hadn't gone to university, you would have been better off. But we are running it dangerously close.
Yeah, I mean, it is worth saying that what is meant to happen is that every year there is meant to be provision accrued for this debt. So it is not the case that come 2030 there will suddenly be a 94 billion debt that suddenly then the Chancellor of the Exchequer will go, oh, what am I going to do about it? Biz are making provision. The whole basis of the funding model is based on the fact that provisions are made for this every year, so that, and of course it also just doesn't happen in 2030, because of course in 2031 you have another slug of debt, in 2032, 2033 and 2024. So every year what is essentially meant to happen is that provision is accrued, X amount is repaid to the book, and the remaining 40-something%, whatever it is at any one point, is not paid off. The other thing, of course, is all of these estimates are basically estimates of what we think graduates may be earning in the future in about 20 or 30 years' time. The confidence intervals on this are massive. So the fact that we kind of debate intensely the kind of the 42 to 44 to 45 to 47, I mean, frankly, nobody has the faintest idea what graduates are going to be doing in 2030 or 2035. So it may be, I'm not saying it is, it may be that actually the book gets paid off very, very quickly. It may be that we have a much worse issue than we think we have. But we don't really yet know. But there is meant to be provision made every year. This is not just kind of debt kicked down the road.
Reassured, Tony?
Not particularly. I've to university and that
John, isn't the answer though that the student loan book is going to be sold off, so this will be a private debt problem rather than the state problem? So what we're inheriting, Tony's absolutely right, and this is why we sponsored this debate. What we are fueling is a debt-ridden next generation that won't be a home-owning democracy. And as a parent of 5 children, quite frankly, I'm disgusted.
Well, it's going to be sold off to the university, doesn't it? Isn't that what Willet's saying?
Well, Willet's was quite mischievous with that, yeah.
Right, okay, well, look, I'm sure you've all got places to be. Thank you very much to all the panellists and to you, the audience, as well, for your questions.